I I know I talked about Coach Joe Kennedy at Bremerton High School last week because Friday night, last time I recorded, that was the night of his first game back on the field when he was gonna do his prayer thing. And of course, he's back in the news this week for entirely predictable reasons that we have to talk about. So I want to bring up this thing because I think this is a good segue into what this story is really all about here. And again, let me just give you some background because I'll clip this and put this as a separate thing on YouTube. But Coach Kennedy, Joe Kennedy, he used to work at Bremerton High School in the state of Washington. He was a assistant football coach for that team. And I think around like 2015, he said, my religion requires me to, Jesus said when the final whistle blows at a high school football game, I have to go to the 50-yard line at midfield. I have to get on my knees and I have to pray. And if the entire world joins me when I do that, so be it. But you know what? Praying at midfield is part of my religion. And so he started doing that. But again, any coach will tell you just because the final whistle blows, you're still on the clock as an employee. You can't just stop doing your job to go do your religious duty because you still have an obligation to the students and you're still representing the district and the public school. So that's why the district said you can't do that. You can pray in your mind all you want, you can pray afterwards, that's fine. But like, this is coercive. This is wrong. You can't do it. Long story short, he filed a lawsuit because he resigned from his position when they said you got to stop doing that. He sued, saying they were violating his religious beliefs. This went all the way. He lost every case. He lost the appeals. He lost the en banc ruling with a bigger appeals court. And finally, it got to the Supreme Court, which is really where the right wing people wanted it all along. And the Supreme Court had to decide, should we take up this case? Okay. And before they made that decision of whether or not to take up the case, Americans United for Separation of Church and State, which was representing one of the law firms representing the school district, they asked the Supreme Court, basically saying, maybe don't take up this case. And they said there's a good reason we don't want you to take up this case because it's not relevant. And the reason they said that is they said, if the Supreme Court issues a ruling, it has to help the people who you are ruling in favor of. And in Joe Kennedy's case, he's saying, I need you to rule in my favor because I want to get back onto the football field, but they won't let me. And Americans United said that your ruling here in his favor would not help him because this is what they asked the Supreme Court. Check this out. This is before the court took up the case. They said, according to public records for this county in Florida, Joe Kennedy now owns a home in Pensacola, which he purchased in 2020. It is our understanding that Joe Kennedy and his wife live in their Pensacola home. Additionally, Joe Kennedy is apparently a registered voter in Florida. Basically saying this guy lives in Florida. So, like, what do you think he's going to do? And then they added here, assistant coaches for the Bremerton High School varsity football team are expected to be physically present at the school to perform year-round coaching duties, including, let's see this, helping in the weight room 3 days a week during the winter, attending and supervising 2 weeks of spring football, being involved in the summer program, which spans several days a week the entire summer. You're at a 4-day camp all summer. You got to be there 6 days per week during the football season for a few months. You're at film breakdown. All these games, basically saying this is a year-round position. I know it's an assistant coach. I know it's a high school, but this is not a short-term gig. You don't just show up for like 2 months, September, October, November, whatever the season is, and then get out. And by the way, if you're like at it, you're doing all of this, they said, for how much? Look at the amount. They even said at current rates, the total annual stipend for Joe Kennedy's coaching position is $5,304. So their point The reason they are saying all this is to say, why would this guy want to fly back, move back permanently to Washington State for this? And they actually wrote in this thing, even if there was any, I'm going to skip down here somewhere, even if there was some genuine possibility that he might decide to leave his home, let me blow this up a bit here, to leave his home in Pensacola, Florida, and move approximately 2,800 miles back to Bremerton, Washington for a $5,304 part-time coaching job, basically saying you can't just give it to him. Even if he promised he would do that, the facts of the case say he doesn't even live there anymore. Hey, Supreme Court, you have every right to toss out this case without adjudicating it, and it would be totally within your right to do that. I think, I mean, I'm not a lawyer here. Americans United said, we really don't want the Supreme Court to take up this case. We know exactly how this will turn out. We are trying to give them a way to get out of this. Here's a way, Supreme Court, for you to save face. You could toss the case on mootness because this case doesn't have any effect on Joe Kennedy, even if he won. And you could do that and no one could be mad at you because you have every reason to do that. Well, guess what Joe Kennedy's lawyer said in response to all this? Joe Kennedy's lawyers wrote to the Supreme Court, and here's what they said. This case is not remotely moot. Petitioner Joe Kennedy believes that he was unconstitutionally removed from his job, and he wants a declaration of his reinstatement. Yeah. Look at this. He remains ready, willing, and able to return to his job just as soon as his constitutional rights are vindicated. It is really that simple. And a phone call to opposing counsel would have confirmed as much and saved the parties like all this hassle. Yeah. Basically saying, look, Supreme Court, if you give us a victory, Joe Kennedy is ready. He's ready to coach. He's ready to get back on the field and help those kids. So this is what they argued in front of the Supreme Court before they took up the case. And they said he's ready to resume the job he loves. So obviously, you know how this story ended, at least partly. Like the Supreme Court said, oh, we're totally taking up this case because look who's on the bench right now. It's 6 of us. They took up that case. They ruled in favor of Joe Kennedy and said, yeah, he can get back on the field. Neil Gorsuch is the guy who wrote the majority opinion, and he just lied. He lied throughout his majority opinion. He said Joe Kennedy was fired over his prayers. No, he wasn't. Joe Kennedy resigned. Gorsuch said said Joe Kennedy's prayers were quiet and personal. No, they weren't. They were mass spectacles. Sonia Sotomayor, in her dissent, showed a picture of one of the prayers, and she's like, nothing about this is quiet or personal. Neil Gorsuch said Joe Kennedy's prayers were not coercive. They were. In fact, briefs filed with the Supreme Court quoted students and their parents saying, yeah, we kind of felt obligated to join in the prayer because, he's the coach and we got to get on his good side and all of this sort of stuff. So it was a bad decision. So I say all that to say, of course, Joe Kennedy last week, as I mentioned, he was coaching again. It took like a year for all the paperwork to go through and for all that, like, for him to stop being a Christian celebrity for like 2 minutes. Apparently, he spent the past year writing a memoir called Average Joe, the Coach Joe Kennedy story. As if anyone cares about this guy's life beyond like, yeah, your 2 minutes of prayer fame here. He was writing that with a ghostwriter. That book comes out next month, so he's hyping it up. They're working on a movie about this guy's life, which again, what do you make a movie about? This is like a 2-minute story, but that movie's being made by the God's Not Dead people. He was consulting with Republican presidential candidates. At least Ron DeSantis met with him personally seeking an endorsement. And Joe Kennedy's like, buddy, I'm on Team Trump, because of course he is. This guy's giving paid speeches. He talked about maybe starting a ministry of some sort. He created a website to promote himself. So he's been busy. He's not really interested in coaching right now. But again, last week was their first game. He's back on the field. And the question is like, well, so did this guy move back to Bremerton, Washington? Answer, No. According to the Seattle Times last week, he was house sitting in Bremerton, and he and his wife have talked about, I'm quoting here, parking an RV on his sister's property in the area during football season, which that's not the same thing as actually moving there. He has not sold his house in Pensacola. And then last week, I don't think we got around to this, but this is what he did last week. At the end of the game, which Bremerton won, good for those kids, Joe Kennedy gets on the field and he starts to pray. And you could see what was interesting to me. I saw a video of this online. What was interesting is he did get to midfield after the game. He walked to midfield, and yeah, there were reporters there. There were cameras there documenting all of this. You know what you don't see there? You don't see kids surrounding him. It was a 10-second prayer. It was actually like quiet and brief, but it's not like there were masses surrounding him. According to articles, there was like a smattering of applause, but it wasn't like some standing ovation or anything like that. This guy did his thing. People gave him golf claps, like a handful of people in the crowd. Yeah, there were a lot of articles written about it because you know why? Because the Supreme Court, all of that was for this moment right here. It was so he could do this shit on the field. So yeah, there was media attention. You know what else? Because he won that lawsuit in the Supreme Court, the school district is obligated to pay his lawyers, I think, like $1.7 million. Some of that's going to come from insurance, but like, yeah, it's a costly thing this guy did to his district. And then he did it. And it seemed like no one really cared, which is hilarious, but he did it. And then a day after all of that, a couple days after all of that happened, the most predictable thing in the world happened, which is Joe Kennedy announced that he was resigning. He said, I'm quitting. Earlier this week, he said, I'm out. And actually, he sent the resignation letter to the district at 4 a.m. on Wednesday. And this is from the Seattle Times here. He said he's resigning due to a family health situation and what he described as a deteriorating situation at the Bremerton School District. First of all, a family health situation? That's interesting because as far as last week when he was giving interviews, didn't mention that. He didn't say there was anything happening. You know what he did say when people asked him like, so are you here for the long haul? Are you going to be here for the next game and everything like that? He's like, I don't want to talk about the next game. Who knows what's going to happen in the future? Like, we all knew this was happening, but he didn't mention there was any health issues. So that's interesting. I'm not saying he's lying about it. I am saying it's kind of weird that this big health issue that prevents you from moving back home suddenly sprang up right at the time everyone stopped caring about Joe Kennedy. So that's one thing. And then he said there's a deteriorating situation at the Bremerton School District. In fact, according to his resignation letter from the Seattle Times, they got a copy of it. He said, it is apparent that the reinstatement ordered by the Supreme Court will not be fully followed after a series of actions meant to diminish my role and single me out in what I can only believe is retaliation by the school district. You could see it right there. Like retaliation. What did they do? What's the retaliation? I have no clue. He didn't describe it. How are they diminishing his role? I have no idea. How are they singling him out? I don't know. None of that makes any sense, and he's not describing it. You know what the district did do? Earlier this year, well, last school year, after the Supreme Court's decision, they passed a new policy regarding prayer at public school functions. And it basically said coaches can pray as long as they are not actively supervising players, which means after the final whistle blows, yeah, Joe Kennedy can do his thing. The district also said you got to keep your distance from students at the beginning of the prayers. So, in order to make sure there's no coercion going on, you got to be alone when you start to pray. After you start to pray, if students on their own want to surround you and pray with you, they can do that. And we're not going to do anything about it. We're not going to punish the coach for that. So basically, the district passed a policy saying everything Joe Kennedy wanted to do and that the Supreme Court gave him the right to do, he could do. He got everything he wanted. And so what is he so mad about? I don't know. I think he just wants to blame anyone he can because the alternative is saying, all right, I did the thing I wanted to do. I quit. I'm going to go be a Christian celebrity now. That's what's really going on. But he doesn't want to say that because it'll hurt the brand. So he's like, you guys, the school district is everyone there is just being a dick to me. So I'm going to blame them and then I'm going to quit and I'm going to say it's because of the school district. Which doesn't I am I am offended because I myself am a public high school coach of sorts. I don't do football, but I am a coach. And everyone who is a coach of any high school anything will tell you, and I've said this before, but like it is a sacrifice. You give up a lot of time, you don't get paid a lot of money. So why do you do it? You do it for the students. You do it because what you get from them is more valuable than a paycheck. When Kennedy decided years ago that he wanted to use his platform to advertise Christianity, that's when you know he doesn't give a shit about the students. He's doing this for himself. He is the main priority for himself. And by the way, when he returned to coaching, that didn't change. You know what did change? The makeup of the student body, because the athletes who were playing football last Friday night are not the students who were around, in 2015. We've gone through a couple generations of students here, and it seems like all the new kids are like, oh god, it's this guy. They didn't want anything to do with him, apparently. You know what's weird too? He totally could have gotten everything he wanted and taken the high road here. He could have said, I'm glad I won the Supreme Court case, but I think if I come back onto the field and if I am an assistant coach once again, it'll take attention away from the students, and that's not fair to them. The kids have a right to play with the spotlight on them. They're the ones playing for a scholarship. They're the ones who may not play football again. I don't want the attention to be on me. I want it to be on them. So I'm going to stay in Florida. But of course, he would never do that because he's a narcissist. He has to have the attention on himself. I think it's only after he realized the media is going away now because no one's going to be there for the next home game, which is not tonight, by the way. I think it's next week. Like, he's not going to stick around to coach when no media is around to follow him and the cameras aren't there to quote everything he says. So he's like, all right, peace out. I'm going to go do my rounds at churches across the country and give speeches. There was a really interesting tweet I want to show you here. This is from David Brody, who is a Christian nationalist. He's a fake journalist. Like, he interviewed Trump a few times when Trump was president. And can you imagine, like, what would you ask Trump if you're a journalist and you get an interview face to face time with Donald Trump? David Brody just asked him softball question after softball question. But check out what Brody wrote on Twitter here. Uh, Here is the statement from Joe Kennedy through his publicist regarding the fact that he has resigned. Blah, blah, blah. Okay, full context. This is the important bit. When I interviewed Coach Kennedy in Bremerton, Washington a few days ago, he told me he felt like an outsider after returning, and things were not the same. During Friday night's return, he spent long stretches of time by himself on the sidelines. He told me the school district and this lawsuit took a lot of the joy out of coaching. Yeah, the school district ruined Joe Kennedy's fun. It's the school district's fault, Like, the lawsuit was Joe Kennedy's decision. Capitalizing on his martyrdom was Joe Kennedy's decision. He could have just done the job and coached, but he's not interested in coaching. Coaching is just the tool he is using to promote Christianity through the taxpayer funded job that he had. Like, you know what else takes joy out of football? Your coach hogging the spotlight. So if you're a student, yeah, the joy might have been sucked out of your victory in the first game of the season. But again, Joe Kennedy doesn't care. So, you know what would be hilarious? What if Joe Kennedy submitted his resignation and then the school district was like, no, we're not accepting this, buddy. You got to coach all season. We're forcing you to coach all season. How pissed off would Joe Kennedy be? He shouldn't be because he said he wanted to do that. But if he had to coach the rest of this season, he would be so mad. He couldn't do his paid speaking gigs everywhere where he pretends he's an actual coach who cares about kids. So I think as I speak right now, the Bremerton students, the football team, is playing its second game of the season. And if they win, I just want them to all the whole team go to midfield after the game, go to the 50-yard line and do the biggest celebratory dance possible and don't pray. And that's your way of sticking it to the coach who ditched you the second he had the chance to do it, right? Oh, that made me so mad. Why would he put everyone through that for his 10 seconds of prayer? All these years, millions of dollars for a 10-second stupid prayer that no one cared about, all for nothing. I mean, I will say maybe it's not for nothing because the Supreme Court didn't do it just for Joe Kennedy. The ruling was written so that a lot of coaches have the option of doing what he did. I haven't seen that play out yet. I haven't heard stories of other public high school football coaches like now demanding that they get to pray on the field after games, but it's possible, I guess. Like this isn't just about Joe Kennedy, but he did get what he wanted. I I don't know if this is a fair comparison. I compared this a lot to like the Kyle Rittenhouse story. Granted, Kyle Rittenhouse has a body count, but his whole thing is I did one thing and then escaped without consequences, and now I'm going to ride that as long as I can. And even if people aren't paying attention anymore, I'm just going to let it go. I'm going to go with it. That's the only thing that is now important in that guy's life. And Joe Kennedy, too. Like, I don't know what the movie's going to be about because it can't be that interesting because he didn't do anything interesting, at least as far as the public concern is going to be. I don't know what he's going to do. Oh, one commenter pointed this out. I thought this too. Kennedy is definitely going to run for office somewhere. I would not put that past him because, again, he's living in Florida. You could launch a campaign for city council, for state house, something like that, on the fame that you currently have and with the Republicans you have in your corner. It's entirely possible. I wouldn't put that past him. I don't think he would do that just yet, though, because there's too much money to be made going around speaking about the case, talking about how I just wanted to be a coach, but no one will let me do it anymore, even though they totally were letting him do it. Um, so, ah, this guy, so annoying.